all talked about food, right? That may continue. So today is the sixth and final week in a teaching series on the Beatitudes called The Blessed Life. And if you haven't been with us, no worries, we're going to catch you up in just a minute. For the past 5 weeks, we've been diving into this central teaching of Jesus. And I think I've said the same thing every week for the past 5 weeks. I'm going to say it again because it just grabs me. Jesus gives this teaching when he's up on a mountain in front of a big crowd. And in that moment, I want to believe he can say anything he wants. Like the whole spiritual playbook is open, and he can teach on God and the nature of God. He could teach about creation. He could teach about unseen spiritual realities. He could teach about sin and struggle and suffering. And with the opportunity to tell people anything in the world, what Jesus chooses to tell them is how they can be blessed, how they can live a life where they find fulfillment and joy and happiness, where both God and they could step back and say, man, I am just fortunate. I'm one of the lucky ones. I am genuinely happy. Now, to recap, I'm going to read through these really quick, and that'll put us kind of on even ground as we move forward this morning. Here's Jesus' picture of happiness in Matthew chapter 5. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up a mountain and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. Blessed are those who recognize they are spiritually helpless. The kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Blessed are those who mourn. They will be comforted. Blessed are those who are gentle. They will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for God's approval. They will be satisfied. Blessed are those who show mercy. They will be treated mercifully. Blessed are those whose thoughts are pure. They will see God. Blessed are those who make peace. They will be called God's children. Blessed are those who are persecuted for doing what God approves of. The kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, lie, and say all kinds of evil things about you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because you have a great reward in heaven. The prophets who lived before you were persecuted in these ways. Now, if you were following along in a paper Bible or even on your phone or tablet or computer, you might see a break in Matthew 5 here, right? You might even see a new headline begin. And this is a good place to remind ourselves that all the chapter numbers, all the verse numbers, all the headings in our Bibles were not in the original text. They've been added later because it helps us find things, right? If you look at ancient versions of the Bible, it's just one giant run-on paragraph per page. We insert numbers so that we can say, oh, that's in Matthew 5, and we have some shot of figuring out where that was. Your Bible probably also adds topic headings to give you kind of a heads up when whatever the writer is talking about is about to shift. Now, the verses I'm going to show you next are not technically in the Beatitudes, but I think, my opinion, they belong right next to them, right? And so here's what Jesus says right after all these blessings. This is Matthew 5:13. You, speaking to the big crowd, you are salt for the earth. But if salt loses its taste, how will it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled on by people. You are light for the world. A city cannot be hidden when it's located on a hill. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket. Instead, everyone who lights a lamp puts it on a lampstand. Then its light shines on everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine in front of people. Then they will see the good that you do and praise your Father in heaven. So these don't really follow, those words don't follow the format of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the, and here's your payoff. But I think they go hand in hand. I was thinking about that this week, and I was thinking about mosaics. You think about the last time you saw a mosaic. These are ancient pieces of art, and there are modern versions too that we'll look at this morning. As a mosaic is an image of someone, or often an intricate pattern, composed of lots of little pieces and little parts. Sometimes you use scraps or leftover things or discarded things, and artists can do this. I can't do it. Maybe you can, to create a beautiful image. Now, I would suggest to you that one way to read the passage that we're studying today is to see it as a mosaic, to see it as a picture that Jesus is painting of all of these little parts and pieces of the Beatitudes. So far, he's given us a glimpse at all the little bite-sized little bits, and now he weaves them all together to say, if you add all that up, here's what you get. You're blessed, and you become salt for the earth, and you become light for the world. Now, if you've ever looked at a mosaic, there are actually two ways that you look at them, right? You step back and you see a whole picture. And then you kind of stand closer, and you can see all the individual little parts. On the screen is a mosaic of Mona Lisa, famous, probably the most famous painting in the whole world, composed of lots of little digital images. You stand back, it reads the Mona Lisa. You look up close, there are just probably thousands of pictures that are all kind of pixelated, and together they form that famous work of art. Well, today, we're going to look at these words of Jesus, and we're going to try to take both of those perspectives. We're going to stand back and see what we can see, and then we'll try to zoom in a little bit and get closer and see how he builds this picture of salt and light. And it always helps if you go the right direction. There we go. If you stand back, you see an image. Now, here are some modern mosaics that I found this week, kind of browsing the web. Jimi Hendrix, famous guitar player. This is just a nature shot, obviously. Who's this? There you go. Whom you're all related to with 7 degrees of separation, like our culture says. We're convinced of this. Martin Luther King Jr., a few different perspectives on him. And a dog, because sometimes you just need a dog in the mix, right? Because it's cute. Okay? You stand back, and these images are all decently easy to read, right? That's Kevin Bacon, that's nature, that's a dog, that's MLK. Well, what happens when you stand back and look at this picture of light and salt? I would suggest to you that what we see is a picture of mission. Jesus is describing who we are and what it is he has in mind for us to do as we live out this blessed life. So let's just take a few minutes and talk straight through these sentences, right? Jesus begins and he says, "You are salt for the earth." Now, who's he talking to in this moment? Is he talking to an elite select group of spiritual, kind of people who are on a whole nother level? No, he's talking to the crowds. He looks at the crowds, he looks out at people like you and me, common people, and he says, I want to talk to you about who you are. You are light and you are salt. And I love this verb that he uses. He says, this is what you are. This isn't what you're going to try to be, what you're going to work really hard and fail at. This isn't what you can hope to aspire to. Jesus says, look, if you follow me, this is a core part of your identity. You are light. You are salt. Like, I love that Jesus has more confidence in us than we have in ourselves, right? We would say, well, I don't know, Jesus, maybe I might be, or sometimes I am. And he says, no, this is who you are. Now, he can make that assertion so confidently because what Jesus does is he shares his identity with us, right? He's innocent, holy, forgiven. He passes that on to us. We become innocent, holy, forgiven people. He's the Son of God. We become the children of God. Did you know this is not the first time that Jesus, or the last time rather, Jesus uses this light of the world wording? He actually says it not just about you and me, but about himself. This is John 8:12. Jesus spoke to the Pharisees again, and he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will live a life filled with light and will never live in the dark. Right? Jesus, now there are a lot of identities that are ascribed to Jesus. He's the Son of God, he's the Son of Man, he's the Messiah, he's the great physician, he's the good shepherd. But one that Jesus speaks to himself is he says, look, I am the light of the world. And this wasn't a one-off thing. In John chapter 9, you turn the page and he says it again. He says, as long as I'm in the world, I am light for the world. Now, I don't know how you hear that, but I hear both identity and mission. This is who I am, and this is what I've come to do, or what I've come to be in this world. I've come to bring light. And Jesus says that about himself, and then he looks at us, Macedonia, and says, you are also light for the world. Right? He calls us light and he calls us salt. Now, what I think is genius about this picture is that his original listeners 2,000 years ago used salt and light every day, didn't they? Everybody 2,000 years ago probably had some version of salt and some version of light in their homes. And 2,000 years later, in a radically different culture, Jesus says salt and light, and we still know what he's talking about, don't we? Yeah, in all our homes, and we come into contact with these things every day. And I think a part of the beauty of this picture is that they're average, common things, right? Salt, light, no big deal. And yet, they tend to transform whatever they come into contact with. Right? Jesus says you're salt for the earth. Now, if you go home today and Google uses of salt, you'll find like 40 or 100 things you can do with salt. But what's the one thing we tend to do with salt? Right, flavor. Somebody in the first service did this, yeah. And most of us don't have trouble getting enough salt in our diets, do we? No, it's the opposite. You go to the doc and he's like, hey, she says, hey, you got to cut back on the salty foods. Blood pressure's a little high. Need you to take this medication. You ever watch any of those cooking shows where they chefs compete against each other, or my favorite is Chopped, where they give them a basket of completely random ingredients and then challenge them to make something, like you might turn on the TV and these poor chefs will be there with a basket and they'll hear inside is whipped cream, Cheetos, cantaloupe rinds, and squid, make a dessert. Go. Right? As I watch those shows, you know what I tend to hear over and over again? As world-class chefs can kind of critique cooking, I often hear them say, you didn't use quite enough salt. I can't think of many times they've said, way too salty. But I can think of numerous times they've said, you have under-seasoned this steak, or you've under-seasoned this sauce, or you just needed a little bit more flavor. So that's one picture. Jesus says that his intent is for you and I to bring flavor to this world. Now, there was another use for salt in Jesus' day, and it was preservation, right? Yet we have to rewind 2,000 years in our brains, which is challenging since most of us are like 70 or younger. But let's rewind to a time when there was no refrigerator. It's a pre-refrigeration culture. And if you happen to get a good catch of fish, or you brought in some food that you wanted to keep a while, you might cure it. Now, I know people in Kentucky, you know about this from like country ham, right? We love some country ham because it's salty, it's been preserved, it's been cured. Jesus says, look, you're going to come into contact with people in this world. You're going to come into contact with neighbors and family members and teams and cultures and classes, and you're going to have an effect. You're going to add flavor. You're going to end up, through the message of Jesus, bring a preserving kind of impact and factor into your world. Now, the other thing that Jesus says is he says you're also light. Now, in our culture, we don't have trouble coming up with physical light, do we? No, flip the switch, plug it in, put the batteries on. I'd say our challenge, just like with salt, is we have too much light, right? Have you ever heard the term light pollution? Right? It's this idea that we have too much artificial light. Check out these images of America. Through the years, top left screen is 1950s. This is how much electric light could be seen at night. Top right image is the 1970s, which is my decade of birth. Lower left-hand corner is 1997. Adults, brace yourself. That was 20 years ago. Like, I know you think 1997 was 5 years ago. That's 20 years ago. And the bottom right-hand corner is 2025, which, again, brace yourselves, is only 8 years away. What do you notice about the progression of artificial light in our country? Man, it's everywhere. In fact, our challenge isn't to figure out how to get light, it's how to get darkness. Right? I went to 4-H camp with my son in April with his 4th grade class, and one of the last nights we were there, they tried to walk us out into the field because they wanted us to see the stars. And you know the first things half the kids did when they got out in the dark? They grabbed their phone and they hit the flashlight app. And we're like, no, we want to be able to see the stars, and there's already too much ambient light. Here's a picture of the same night sky in different settings. To your far left, you have a city setting, right? Like downtown Chicago, downtown Louisville, maybe downtown Lexington. To the left of that, the second one to your left, is kind of the suburban-urban transition. The middle one is the suburban sky. The fourth one is the rural sky. And then if you get to the far right, it's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. What's the Kentucky term for that? The sticks? I don't know. What do you call that, right? The more electronic light we lose, the less you actually can see the beauty of the stars, right? Yeah. We have too much light. I'm not sure that was the problem 2,000 years ago. And to get light in Jesus' culture, you actually had to spend some kind of commodity. Now, we do too, but we don't think about it because we pay a power bill and we just get what we need. But in Jesus' culture, you were burning up wood or burning up wax. And think about what light did for you. In Jesus' culture, if you didn't have light, as soon as it got dark, you were done for the day. I don't mean done working, I mean done. Like, unless you wanted to stumble around your house in the dark and hurt yourself, there was no family dinner in the dark, there was no game time in the dark, none of that. Light brought security. Right? Being able to light your house probably made it more secure. So Jesus says, look, here's who you are. You're common people, but you're going to have an impact. You're going to bring flavor. You're going to bring preservation. You're going to light a path. You're going to push back darkness. And you're going to do this for the world, like for the whole earth. Now, last Sunday, was one of those teachings that I would say I was not necessarily looking forward to. Like if people who teach the Bible will teach the Bible, they're going to come across things that they're like, oh, nobody wants to hear this. Like, but it's in there, so you need to teach it, right? Last Sunday was blessed are the peacemakers, which sounds kind of noble and like diplomatic, but Jesus' idea of making peace is if somebody hits you in the face, turn the cheek and let them hit the other side. That doesn't sound so warm and fuzzy to me. And then he says, look, blessed are the persecuted. That was that big chunk at the end that we read. And I got to tell you, I looked out in both our services, and most of y'all don't have a great poker face, right? I can tell when you're getting sleepy. I get that. I get sleepy too. I can tell when you're hungry. And I could tell there were more people than I could count on both my hands did not like what Jesus was saying last week. Because the idea of making peace by allowing yourself to be taken advantage of doesn't sit well with the American culture. The idea of making peace by allowing, somebody to do wrong to you or being punished for doing the right thing, that just doesn't sit well with our concepts of justice and, all those things. And maybe you walked away thinking, Jesus, what are you doing here? I don't know that I like this. Are you saying that evil's going to triumph? Are you saying that darkness is going to win? Jesus says no. But darkness is going to be pushed back not through physical violence, but by your life, right? This world is not going to rot. It's going to be preserved with the way you live. You, Macedonia, are light for the world. You're salt for the earth, right? Not just for your homes and neighborhoods and workplaces and classrooms, but far beyond. So Brett Jackson mentioned in his prayer this morning, for his comments about the offering, that we were just in a board meeting, and one of the things we did in the board meeting was look at our missions work. And our missions work is here in Lexington, and it's out in California, and it's in Africa, and it's in Haiti. And so whether you know it or not, as you give, you're actually light and salt around the world, to places you're never probably going to visit. Jesus said, look, I intend, when you step back, here's what you're going to see. Darkness is not going to win. Right? I'm going to bring light and preservation, and I'm going to bring it through you, because this is who you are. Now, remember the context here is Jesus is telling us what will make us happy. So what do we think makes people happy? I'm going to show you some options. I didn't have space to give you every option, so I'm going to give you 4. And then after I show the options, we're going to vote out loud audibly, okay? So here are the options. Which of these, and I'm only giving you 4, which would make people the happiest? Is it rising to a position of power? Is it being able to buy whatever you want, having the resource that if you see it, you can go and get it? Is it receiving lots of awards and lots of recognition? Is it making a real difference in somebody's life? Okay, count of 3, let's vote. You say the letter. There's a letter next to each of those. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, almost unanimous, isn't it? Same way in the first service. Now, all these other things, there may be people who are bent for those things, or it's okay to get them along with knowing you're making a difference in somebody's life. But Jesus says that you are light, and I'm light, and we're salt, because he knows what really makes us happy isn't necessarily how much we earn, or the plaques that hang on our wall, or what lives in our garage. It's knowing that we made a difference in this world. And so this is the mission, right? To make a difference in this world. Now, a very fair question to ask is, how do you do that? Okay, Jesus, I'm in. If this is your path and you say this is what I'm doing, I'm in. Let's get practical. How do we do that? So this is where we want to stand back and see the picture of mission. But if you look closer at a mosaic, what you actually end up seeing is the method. You stand back, you see the big image or the pattern. You get closer, you see how they put all that together. Right? For example, let's go back to these images I showed you earlier. This picture of Jimi Hendrix, fittingly, is actually built from guitar picks. Probably should be, right? This nature scene is actually composed entirely of butterfly wings. It's done by a man who collects butterflies, and apparently if the wings fall off, it's no longer a good specimen to collect, and he hated seeing them go to waste, so he just started piling them up, and he makes works of art out of them. Kevin Bacon is actually composed of bacon. Which means it's not only interesting but delicious, apparently, right? This photo of a dog, if I let you guess, you probably couldn't guess. It's made out of candy sprinkles. You know, you go through the grocery line, you buy the little jar of sprinkles that cost $4 for some reason, for 1.5 ounces, and then if you give it to your, young child to decorate, they use the whole thing on one cupcake, those sprinkles. Each sprinkle is one dot in that picture. This picture of MLK is actually built out of 4,242 Rubik's Cubes, all arranged so that when they're put together, they read as three faces of Martin Luther King Jr. Right? It's one thing to step back and see the big picture, your light, your salt, but if you get closer, Jesus is actually going to give us some instruction on how we live that way in the real world. Now, I'm going to give you two ideas today, and the first one, I just would love for you to brace yourself because you are going to be blown away by how complicated this is. When I tell you, you're going to say, Fred, we had no idea of your intellectual capacity and your ability to be brilliant, okay? But here it is. You actually make a difference in this world by living differently. Right? Isn't that great? You make a difference by being different. You make a difference by being the same. You make a difference by being different from the world around us. And this is a key theme as Jesus talks about both salt and light. Right? He says, you're salt for the earth, and then he adds this thought. If salt loses its taste, how will it be made salty again? Now, today we know that salt doesn't really lose its taste, chemically speaking. The chemical composition of salt crystals never change. What Jesus is likely describing here is the process of dilution. Right? In Jesus' culture, they would have harvested salt from the sea. In fact, people still do this today. Like Thailand's like a big sea salt producing community, and I don't think the method has changed much. They create these little pools of salt water, and then as the salt begins to kind of show itself, they rake it toward the middle. Right? Think back 2,000 years ago. They get these piles of salt, and they scoop it up, and what's under the salt? Sand, probably, and some of that goes in the bag, too. And then the salt merchant probably looks at his salt, and if he's not 100% honest, he may figure out if I add a little more sand to my 10 pounds of salt, now I have 15 pounds of salt, right? And then you buy your little bag of salt in the market, and when you get to the bottom, what you've probably got is mostly sand. And you sprinkle it on whatever you're eating, and you say, man, my salt just isn't salty anymore. And Jesus says, well, you know what you do with that? You just throw it out. Now, I've never had that experience. When I use the little sea salt cranky thing on my, table, it's always salty and it's always only salt. But I bet you've had this experience in a different way. Okay, I asked you to think of your favorite salty snack, and if you didn't do it a few minutes ago, you can dial that up now. How many of us said it's chips of some version? A lot of chip fans. How about pretzels? I've seen that. How about some version of like nuts, peanuts? Yeah. Anybody have anything really weird we should know about that they're into with chips and salty stuff? All right, good. I was worried about you. All right. Now, if you think about your favorite salty snack, has your loved one, your mom, your dad, your whoever, with great intentions ever bought you the lower sodium or unsalted version of that snack? And you may not have noticed, and you're just digging into the chips, or you're into the peanuts, or you're into the popcorn, and you thought something is wrong. Like, this does not satisfy me at all. And then they come with some, gobbledygook about your health and want you to live a long time and, your blood pressure. And you're like, yeah, I just want my popcorn salty. If I'm going to eat the calories, it ought to have like a payoff, right? And I've got a hunch that if you've ever had that experience, you may not have eaten that whole bag of chips. And eventually they got stale, and you know what you did with them? You threw them out, which is exactly what Jesus says will happen. If you're counting on salt and you don't get salt, then you just kind of move on, right? He expects us to be different. Salt has an impact when it's added to something different, not when it's added to salt itself, right? This is on the screen is an excerpt of Jesus' prayer for his disciples before he moves on to face his trial and his torture and the execution that happens for him on Easter weekend. And so this is one of the final things he prays over people like us. This is what he says. He's talking to his Father in heaven. He says, I've given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I'm of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. What's Jesus saying? Father, I'm praying for my followers because they are different. Right? They're in this world, but they're not exactly like everybody in the world. Now, no better based on your own merits, just learning to live differently in the steps of Jesus, right? So what does it mean to live differently? Well, I would suggest if you get up really close to this picture of salt and light, Jesus has already put together a bunch of thoughts about what it looks like to live differently. Because we've said, man, spiritually helpless. Our culture doesn't want to do that. We want to be capable. Mourning, nope. We always want to have a good time. Gentle, nah. People like power. Thirsting for righteousness, no. People have a lot of... We went and said, man, all this stuff is counter-cultural and often counter to our, broken human leanings. I don't know that you have to invent a whole lot of different ways to live differently. Jesus has already told us how. He says, look, if you will, with my help and with the Holy Spirit's assistance, learn to walk this path, you will be different. And you'll make a difference. So you make a difference by actually living differently. And you make a difference by living an engaged life. Now, this, I think, for some of us, might be the harder piece. I don't know if you've ever noticed this. I've noticed this. Maybe if you've been around a while, you've seen the same thing. The more people become like Jesus, the more they tend to distance themselves from the people they knew before they knew Jesus. And the more people fall in love with God, the more they tend to step away from their culture, right? And there's some beauty in that. Like if you're being influenced instead of having an influence, there are times to step back and step away. But catch this. Jesus' intent is that the light and salt that we represent is mixed into our world. In fact, go back with me for a second. John 17, this is Jesus' prayer. There's one thing he prays won't happen. Check it out in the middle of the screen. He says, my prayer is not that you take them out of the world. I'm praying that they don't cloister up and they don't withdraw and they don't form their own Christian neighborhoods and Christian clubs and Christian world, because then salt doesn't ever get to flavor anything. Salt never preserves anything. Light never comes into contact with darkness. Now, the next part of the prayer is beautiful. He says, look, I'm asking you to protect them from the evil one, Father, because I want them to stay in this world, engaged in this world. Because salt and light make a difference when they come into contact with things. In fact, he fleshes this point out as he talks about us as the light of the world. He says, a city cannot be hidden when it's located on a hill. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket. Now, I don't know how many lamps you light in your house. We don't really light any lamps in our house. But occasionally, several times a year, we have a power outage. And you know what you do when you have a power outage at night. Everybody tries to find the flashlight, their cell phone, a candle, whatever it is. And I don't care where you left those things last. They'll not be where you think they are when the power's out. Right? If you have a shelf that's the dedicated flashlight shelf, there won't be a flashlight on it when the power goes out. Right? In our house, whenever the power goes out, we kind of have a little mini race to see who can kind of, it's kind of informal, but you want to be the person who finds the light. And when you find the light, you don't turn on the flashlight and cover it up with your hand and keep stumbling around in the dark and breaking things and breaking your toes. You find the light and you let it shine. And Jesus says, look, here's your challenge. You can't, the more you fall in love with me, you cannot disengage from this world. You can disengage with the values of the world. You can disengage from the influence of the world, but you've got to find a way to be present. Because salt in the salt shaker doesn't flavor anything. And light covered up doesn't push back any darkness. And he wraps it this way, just so we're clear. He says, in the same way, let your light shine in front of people. Now, let's guess, and that's what we often do when we read the Bible. Do you think Jesus only means Christian people? Probably not, because he's already said you're light for the church, right? No, you're light for the whole world. In the same way, let your light shine in front of people, in front of your neighbors, in front of your classmates, in front of the people on your teams, in front of the people you call family, everywhere. Then they will see the good that you do and praise your Father in heaven. Now, I think Jesus just gave us a gift here this morning, because often when we talk about how to make a difference in this world, when we talk about how to share our faith, when we talk about having an impact and influence, the thing I hear more often than not is people will say, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to talk about my faith. I don't know how to make the gospel connect with people. I don't know how to, that's why we have you, Fred. You do that for us, right? Jesus doesn't talk about what you're going to say. What does he talk about? What you're going to do. People will see the way you live. And there's going to be a time to speak. There's going to be a time to share. There's going to be a time to talk about Jesus. But the light piece is they're going to see what you do. So what is he expecting you to do? I think he's already told us. People will watch you forgive other people and say to themselves, I don't know that I could have done that. What makes her able to do that? People will watch you make peace when you could be dramatic and stir it all up and keep it all going. And they'll say, man, I'd have stirred that pot. How did he manage to just let that be? People will hear us be honest about our own faults and flaws and the fact that we're not capable and we're not able. And they'll say, man, that humility just feels a lot different from what I'm used to. I wonder where they get that from. They'll see the good that you do, and they'll praise not you and me, they'll praise the Father. So, Jesus says this, hey Fred, you're salt for the earth. Hey Macedonia, you're light for this entire world. You're common people, but as a key part of your identity as my followers, you will make a difference. You will have an impact and a result. So, as we're heading out in just a little bit, I want to ask you to take this question with you. And we talked about two parts of kind of being salt and light as we stood close and looked at, the Beatitudes. And I'm wondering which feels more challenging for you right now. Does it feel more challenging to live differently? Or does it feel more challenged to be engaged? Now, some of us very engaged with the world, very engaged with our culture, but our life might not look a lot different right now. And maybe God's prompting and impressing you to say, look, I really want you to start living your faith out in front of people, and if you do, you'll be different. Maybe for you, it's being engaged, that you're very different from the world, but you're not in the world. And God says, look, that salt needs to get out of the salt shaker, and that light has to get uncovered. And can I just tell you, I want to say, when you do that, it's going to feel so good, it'll probably feel weird. Like it feels weird to me. My daughter played lacrosse this year for Hayes Middle School, and our coach was looking for somewhere to have the end of the year picnic. And I happen to have a park behind my house, and I know there's not a lot of budget for lacrosse middle school, right? The lacrosse middle school girls' budget is not really robust, and so I said, hey, our church owns a park. We'll share it with you. Come, let's have the picnic. And we've enjoyed watching our daughter play lacrosse all year. In fact, super proud of her. She volunteered to be the goalie. Like, never played lacrosse before, but said, I'll stand there and you guys throw things at me, right? And if they get by me, it's my fault, right? So super brave. She did a great job. But my wife and I knew that a part of our daughter playing lacrosse is that we were having an opportunity to be engaged with people. And we sat on the sidelines and we got to meet people. And here's the thing. It often felt awkward. Because the conversations that are going to happen. Well, what do you do? Well, I work for IBM, or I'm, whatever. What do you do? I'm a pastor. Weird, right? And often in a group of like 20 people, there'll be one who's like, oh, I love my church. Good for you. No, like not a single, there was not one like, oh, cool, we're at the park. And they're like, so who owns this park? Our church. Well, that's weird. And why do you live in that house? Well, they just didn't get it. And yet I have every confidence that God's calling us to be engaged. And I don't know how he's going to write that story or where it's going to land, but I just offer you, if you go home and you're like, all right, honey, we're going to get to know our neighbors and we're going to be engaged in people's life, and it feels weird, that's normal. At least it is for me. All right? So, in your journal, with your spouse, as a family, in your small group, if you're part of a small group, these might be good questions to ask. Which of these is more challenging right now when it comes to light and salt? Is it being different, or is it being engaged? So, that wraps up the Beatitudes, Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 to 16. And I would encourage us that even though we're done with the Beatitudes might not be done with you. They might be not done with us, right? Our goal as we open up the scriptures every week is not simply to understand what's being said, but to let God work in our lives in these things. And so it might not be a bad idea, even though we're done and we're moving on next Sunday to a new topic, this summer to continue to revisit Matthew 5. And to find the places where you sense God bringing you in an inordinate amount of comfort or an inordinate amount of challenge. I tend to notice God speaking because I feel the pinch, right? I feel like I'm good with that. I think I got that down. Ow, that hurts a little bit. And often that's when God wants to say something to me. He might speak to you through a deep sense of peace or comfort. But let's keep listening together. Next Sunday, a brand new teaching series for the summer called Questions and Answers. Now, I know in some churches you're not allowed to ask questions. That's not the case here. It's actually good to ask questions. But often when we think about questions and answers, we think that we're the ones with the questions, and our Sunday school teacher, our pastor, or God himself might provide the answers. And that works sometimes. But this summer, we're actually going to switch those roles. One of the things that Jesus loved to do, if you read about his life, is he loved to ask people questions. In fact, he asks more questions than he gives answers. Because instead of just giving us a little information to walk away with, he'll often pose a question so that we'll have to look deep inside. So, for the next 8 weeks, Jesus is going to ask some questions of very real people in the Bible. And we're going to bravely adopt those questions for ourselves and see what God might have to say to us. Now, we know it's summer. We know you're going to be gone. I hope you're gone. I hope you get some time away. I hope you get some rest. Many of our series kind of build up, and one week builds on the next. That's not the case with this one. Every week stands alone. So if you're gone 3 weeks, pop back in. You can come on in week 4. Right? We hope we can see you every week you're here because you add something to this family. You add a little bit of seasoning and a little bit of flavor, and you add your story and your journey. But even if you're out a few weeks, don't let that stop you from coming back in. All right.